All right, let's begin. So, hi, good to see you again. My name's Donnie D'Amato. I'm very grateful to be here with you today. First, a little bit of an introduction. I am a design systems architect. Uh, so I have an expertise in something called design tokens, and these are variables in our experiences that manage design decisions and let teams express themselves in like lots of different visual ways. And currently, I'm the team lead on the team responsible for the design system at GoDaddy, which is the world's largest domain registrar with over 20 million customers worldwide. It's a lot of people. And I also currently teach user experience design at FIT in New York City. And I've previously taught at Parsons School of Design and the New York Institute of Technology. And of course, these are all things that you could find on my LinkedIn profile. What many people might not know is that before tech, I used to be an interactive sculptor. I loved making things that a person could walk around and touch and react with. The problem is that that kind of like gets expensive. Purchasing all those materials for only a few people to see is like often disheartening. So when I learned how to make a website, I was hooked. Now I can make as many interactive pieces as I wanted and show them all over the world. That's the beginning of how I've gotten in front of you today, you know. But speaking of today we're going to explore creativity, not just the kind that makes something look good, but the kind that helps solve problems in ways that you might not expect. We'll be looking at how our minds approach challenges, what can get in the way, and how noticing these things can nudge our thinking in new directions. So to start, I want to get a little bit of a read of the room here. Has anyone here heard of a fellow named Karl Duncker? It's okay if you haven't. So, been for a long time ago. All right. But we're going to replicate one of his experiments. What I want you to do is I want you to imagine that I give you the following items. All right. Box of thumbtacks, a book of matches, and a candle. Now, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to use these items and affix a candle to the wall in a way such that the wax doesn't drip off down onto the floor. Again, take a look at these items and think about how you might do that. How would you do that? I know it sounds a little bit like something out of the show Taskmaster, right? Maybe I should have started with like, your time starts now, make it a little bit more exciting, right? But for me, it makes me feel like, or think of MacGyver. MacGyver's a show from the 90s that where like the main protagonist was MacGyver, and he would improve clever solutions to get out of dangerous situations, like defusing a bomb with a paperclip or making an escape vehicle out of some duct tape and a lawnmower engine, right? Look at him, right? He's gorgeous, right? It just awestruck. Well, sorry, let me get back on track. But anyway, he had my favorite show growing up as a kid. And this was fun for me because it was problem solving. And to watch a hero use their intelligence over brute force was inspiring. He was the personification of reframing a problem, of thinking outside of the box. Actually, speaking of that, do you know where the term thinking comes out of the, sorry, think out of the, to think outside of the box and where that comes from? Does anybody have an idea where that comes from? I'm just curious. I see some head shaking. That's okay. We're gonna tell you. Many people believe that it comes from this particular puzzle here. So you're given 9 dots arranged in this 3 by 3 grid, and you're asked to connect all of the dots using only 4 straight lines. Take a moment and think about how you might do this. And don't worry, I'll show you what the answer is in a moment. Now, the term that we're discussing might be a little bit of a giveaway. The answer here is actually to draw the lines outside of the perceived box created by the dots. That looks like this, right? Now, for many, this box that was created by the dots is a self-imposed constraint. The task never said that you couldn't draw outside of the grid or that you had to stop on any particular dot. Many folks assume that because of the box created by the dots here, you must stay inside of it. But what made MacGyver so special is that he operated without any of these self-imposed constraints. This puzzle wouldn't like confine him to the thoughts within this square. Instead, he would see this as an opportunity to literally think outside of this box. So today, I want to give you all superpowers like my hero MacGyver. I want to unlock your creative potential because there's something big that's potentially keeping you from it. And that's something that psychologists call functional fixedness. So, functional fixedness is a cognitive bias that limits a person to use an object only in the way that it was traditionally used. It causes people to think a fork can only be used to pick up food or that your shoes are only made for walking. In our normal day to day lives, this is a useful shortcut. We don't need to spend time figuring out what to do with an object every time we see it. We have learned what common objects are for, and we regularly use that knowledge to our advantage. But to have problem solving superpowers, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to need to break out of these shortcuts and reprogram our minds. We're going to need to actually pause and think just a little differently. So, as another exercise, let's say that you need to carry some small personal items, but you have no pockets. Certainly, it would be better if you had a bag, but what if you didn't? What would you do? Right? Think about it. I have some small things here, maybe a phone, maybe a pen. How would you carry that stuff if you didn't have the thing that you were usually using to carry? Well, maybe you have a scarf and you can tie the ends together and create like a small bag. Or maybe you can find some cardboard and fold it together to create like a shoddy briefcase. Maybe you're wearing some socks. Maybe you could use them and carry some things, right? Necessity is the mother of invention, they say. Now, in that exercise, instead of thinking about this specific problem to solve, let's think about this in reverse. What could you do with the items around you? As an example, what else could you do with a sock? So, the things that come to my mind when someone gives me that kind of challenge, I think maybe I could use the sock as a mitten if I have like a cold hand, or maybe two hands, right? I could unravel that sock and have it as string if I need to tie some things together. I could even fill this sock with some rocks and maybe it could become like a weapon, right? And this is the kind of game that I would play to like pass the time. Not rock socking your friends. I wouldn't do that, no. But when I was bored without the internet, I would look at the objects around me and consider all the alternative ways that I could use each one. And it's not about thinking about the objects as a whole. It's also thinking about all the properties of the object's parts and how I could use them in hypothetical scenarios. It's like playing goal-oriented make-believe. Super fun for kids, right? I spy with my little eye something that could hold water. But when we think in this way, we tend to have more options than we would otherwise have with functional fixedness. When a person who lacks functional fixedness looks at a problem, they aren't upset when the precise solution isn't available. It actually triggers a creative spark with the resources around them to create that viable solution. Now, I'm sure you're asking, why am I spending all this time with puzzles and socks? Well, because cognitive biases like functional fixedness show up everywhere in our work as designers and engineers. Our peers will look at the limited options that are provided in a component library or the accessible yet restrictive color palette and complain that they can't be creative with all these rules, right? One of the things we hear all the time is design systems are killing creativity. So instead, what do? They work in like these dark corners of their infinite canvas, sliding mock-ups into the DMs of stakeholders, trying to get buy-in underneath the table. Don't think we don't see you, right? What I believe is that our peers are actually imposing their own subconscious restrictions, a collection of cognitive biases that they're unaware of. And it's these biases that affect whether the people that we work with actually innovate and improve or just mindlessly copy what has come before. I want to talk about a couple more cognitive biases that could potentially affect the way that we work here. So, one of these other ones is something called the halo effect. And the halo effect describes when a person is blinded by someone's historically good behavior, overlooking more recent poor behavior. So, for example, let's say that a hypothetical company was to give their UI like a very beautiful visual refresh, right? But has also made their content nearly invisible as a result. The halo effect would describe a bias that people would have to only see the good in this update, even if the overall experience has objectively suffered. liquid glass. Excuse me. Oh my God, I don't know where that came from. But another bias that we could see is the bandwagon effect. And the bandwagon effect describes when people adopt certain behaviors and styles or attitudes simply because others are doing so. I think many people are guilty of this, especially when it comes to competitive analysis. When we're looking to introduce a new pattern or resource, we naturally look at what other people have done. And we use what we see out there in that data to inform our own decisions. Unfortunately, in many cases, companies are looking at each other for the same answers. And then after all of that happens, we're kind of all in this one big bandwagon, just pointing at each other, being like, let me take that. No, I'll take that. And it's all the same all over the place, right? And staying on this bandwagon can result in boring, uninspired, and sometimes even harmful patterns like this one. This is Material Design's floating labels. And this was introduced many years ago, but at first it looked like a fresh take on an otherwise boring form field. Like, what's wrong with adding a little bit of delight to my text input, right? And because it was Google, people assumed that it wasn't designed to be evil. It even was popular on the web by being added to some of the larger frameworks like Bootstrap 5 at the time. But what happened? Well, several years later, we identified as a practice that this popular pattern is actually riddled with poor usability. Users would report that the label is often mistaken for a pre-filled value, and that the label text is too small to read, but also requires the input to be much larger to hold it. And don't get me started on making this thing behave with autofill features, right? The input wasn't broken. There was no problem to solve. The designer was just bored, and unfortunately, your users were frustrated as a result. Now, I wanted to see how popular this pattern was still after all of these years. I ended up doing some research and looked at several design systems out there, dozens of them, in fact, and reviewed what their inputs would look like these days to see how many actually used floating labels. I'm happy to report that I'm the only one, I'm sorry, the only one that I found was Google Material. So I have to, I guess, be admiring their commitment to this pattern. But instead of just shaming Google Material here, let's shame all of these design systems equally, right? Equal opportunity here, folks. Let's talk about modals. I believe that the decision to use a modal is often overused and impulsive. It's where we're conveying a new concept without navigating to a new page, but also letting you do things on the current page, even though those things are sort of visible, and then focus could suddenly jump, or maybe it doesn't because it'll implement it poorly. It's just a very weird state for you to put your user in. But unfortunately, we've gotten into this habit where we think we need to have a modal for everything. And one of the most popular, so that's word again, popular, uses for the modal is for something called double confirmation. So in this example here, a user wants to delete something and we want to make doubly sure that they're meant to hit that button. So to do that, we disrupt them with a pop-up to check. And because of this, many component libraries include this kind of pattern so that we could support this usage. But what if your design system didn't have this modal? What would happen? Well, what might come to mind first is a mutiny, because a designer would believe that they are personally now bestowed the responsibility of designing their own modal, giving it to their team to build, and then blame the design system along the way for not having this thing that they needed. But instead, let's think about this as a designer without cognitive bias, without the functional fixedness. If we didn't have this modal to use, what could we use out of a system to be sure that the user was meant to delete this item? Well, one of the alternatives patterns here that I've seen to ensure that the user is taking a deliberate action is by directing them to type the name of the thing that they want to delete. So as an example, here I'm going to have a mock-up of how this might look in GitHub's danger zone, which is part of the GitHub profile. This is showing how you might delete a repository. But the act of typing the name or even copying and pasting it is deliberate. So there's very little question about the intent here. Admittedly, I'd say this is even better, better than the double confirmation modal, especially since we don't need to juggle focus between the delete button and the focus within the new modal and back again. That focus could stay on the form until the user navigates after a valid command is complete. But look, if you're uncomfortable with novel patterns that you've never seen before, that's okay. I have another alternative. Let's instead use a really old pattern. Instead of immediately deleting the item on a button press, let's move it to a trash bin, right? Where it stays in a recoverable purgatory for 30 days. That way, the act of deleting isn't as destructive as it would otherwise be. Okay? It's more safe. And this concept has been a part of personal computing for nearly 50 years. Apple even advertised it as if you can find a trash can, you can run the computer. It's ubiquitous and grounded in the real world, right? And I'm sure that you have your own trash can in your house. I'm sure you potentially even pick things that you didn't mean to throw out of it over your life, right? I'm sure that's something that's happened for all of us. But what's a real world modal? Is that a jump scare? Is that a door-to-door salesman? Both of those things are disruptive and uninvited, right? So hopefully these examples are inspiring and start a modalist design revolution. I, for one, would enjoy seeing fewer modals in my experience. And I'm confident that there are other patterns that we could use to replace modals everywhere, except, of course, of those very important pop-up ads. But I believe that the way that we improve our experiences is by embracing constraints and exercising these alternatives. But it's totally possible that we could have too many constraints to be too restrictive. I mean, if I told you that there were no interactive components in your component library, you simply cannot make an interactive application. There has to be some threshold. Unfortunately, many of the teams in our practice have overshot this threshold. They have too much stuff. It's like the opposite of having constraints. And in my expertise, I find this all the time when we see design token hierarchies. Many of the public design systems out there boast hundreds or even thousands of design tokens and ask, is this maximum creativity? I'm afraid not. Because Hicks' law says that the more options you provide, the harder it is to choose the right one. When you only provide a few options, picking the most appropriate one is easier and faster. It's the difference between having a dozen font sizes and having only three. With only three options, it becomes much clearer which one to choose. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How could I possibly express all of the pages of a particular experience with only three kinds of text? Well, what if I went further? What if I told you that I believe it's possible to describe nearly any UI interface in less than 3 dozen design tokens? I'll say that again. What if I told you I believe it's possible to describe nearly any UI interface with less than 3 dozen design tokens? Hopefully, for the folks who know design tokens, that sounds interesting, but maybe it sounds impossible. I'm going to, hopefully convince you otherwise here because this is an idea that I've been thinking about for over 4 years now at this point. But it all started with something that looks like this. I think many people have seen something that looks like this. We have a light colored page with a dark colored footer. And traditionally, the way that we might support something that looks like this is we would have base or default design tokens that describe the larger page right over here, right? And in order to do that, we would have some design tokens, maybe the word text color to describe what that text is supposed to be. So this color here. And then in the footer, because it's a special area, we would have another token to describe the color that's here. So maybe like a text on dark. Okay? So let's have that set up here. Oop. There we go. Now, this seems fine for the start of it, but what happens if there's additional things that begin to appear in this bottom area? So maybe they need some tokens for all the buttons and the links, right, that are on this dark area. Okay, we could add those. Then what about if we have a newsletter sign up, right? And now we need a form field down there. So we need tokens to describe all the states for the form field. Okay, well, we'll have to add those too. And now we're going to have to provide error messaging and help messaging for folks that are entering the wrong information into that newsletter field. So we need help and error messaging tokens specifically for that on dark version. And the thing is, before you know it, all of the design tokens you had up here will be duplicated for all the things down here. You've now duplicated the amount of tokens that you're maintaining. And this is how it contributes to this idea of design token bloat, to Hicks' law and having too many options to choose from and to manage. Now, what I'd like you to consider instead is what if we didn't have new tokens just because of the different look in this footer? What if we used the same text color token inside of the footer? That's going to look like this. So again, text color on top, that's going to describe all the text that we see here, and that's black or a dark color. And then we have text color on the bottom, which is describing all this text that's here, and that's going to be white, right? Or a light color, right? Again, the name has not changed, only the value. That's the important part of this approach that I'm trying to describe here, right? Because these things, these design tokens, are effectively variables after all. They don't need to have permanent values. So now in the footer, text color maps to the light color, but outside the footer, it maps to that dark color. And what I'm describing here is the foundation behind an approach called mise-en mode. And behind it is a framework that answers questions about how many design tokens you need, what they are, and ultimately how to empower your marketing department to make it pop all by themselves. Imagine letting the people who actually care about what color the button is the ability to change that button with independence. And maybe it sounds less like a dream and more like a nightmare to the accessibility advocates, but let these folks be responsible adults, responsible for their own decisions. If they want to make the button yellow with black text, they should be able to do that. If you aren't in the pipeline maintaining all these tokens, it's all on them, leaving more time to do the things that are important to you instead. Now, if you want to learn more about this approach, about UI theming and expressing yourself in lots of different ways, I actually have a book that goes into detail, which you can go to mode.place on the internet. And there's lots of resources about it there. In fact, there's a conference talk that I did that introduces this several years ago in San Francisco. So you can go to mode.place and check it out if you'd like. But in my opinion, an approach like mise-en mode doesn't come from stepping on the bandwagon. It doesn't come from copying what's popular. It comes from noticing the invisible constraints that we put on ourselves and removing them. Just like how MacGyver could look at a pile of stuff and immediately see potential, we can teach ourselves to do the same in our own work. So take a moment, think. What invisible constraints are shaping the way that you approach your projects right now? Which assumptions are quietly limiting what you think is possible? Something you can try with your own projects. Look at a complex pattern in your experience and just add a constraint. What would happen if you couldn't use color? How could you convey a choice without a pop-up? How does it feel to navigate with only one hand? That phrase from earlier, design systems kill creativity, I think is only half of the sentence. The full quote that I want you to take home is that design systems kill creativity when bias limits possibility. That's how we get from modals as the norm to deliberate accessible alternatives, from token overload to a system that empowers organizations, and from a box of thumbtacks to a solution that shows off your new superpowers. Thank you. I see the clapping, I don't hear it, but I'm sure it's a roar applause. I know. It was excellent, right? All right. I'm not sure what happens next. Is there a Q&A or is it just on to the next? How does it work?
So we could do a Q&A, but there actually is a networking
Oh,
and yeah, there's a networking dinner thing that's going on right now over in the top gallery. But if we want to have if people are super hungry, they can start heading over. But if somebody does want to ask a couple questions, or are there anybody who may want to ask some questions to Donnie? Do you see anybody? Any hands? all you have to do is just talk with the owl, so it's almost like he's right there, but he's not. But yeah, absolutely.
So it's just like, why don't we just create the whole design system in the way that we actually want? Like, it's like, as you mentioned, design system, they literally kill the whole creativity. Why don't we regularly update it? And we update it regularly.
Yeah, so the difficulty that I'm solving for in here in terms of creating the design system that you want, the reality ends up being is that that system changes very often over time. And the maintenance of changing that over time is very significant. So what we've seen over the years of maintaining design systems, just from handling something like a light and a dark mode for our users, if we don't have systems like this in place, it makes it very hard to change from light to dark, right? So we need these proxies and these systems to then inform the larger system as a whole for the organization. So what we'll see sometimes is, for example, you'll have, like I mentioned in the presentation, you'll have some marketing manager that comes in and says, "Hey, we have a promo, we got to get it out." And that promotion is going to potentially look different than anything else on your site has been before. And that generally is some several days or worse, weeks worth of work where the marketer is just like, "Isn't it easy to make the colors change?" And you're like, "No, there's so much system that we didn't think of before." And what this mise en mode presentation or approach provides is the framework in which a marketer can come down into your office and ask, "Hey, can we make this thing for Easter?" And you could say, "Yep, it'll be out in an hour." Right? And that kind of thing is super powerful in these large organizations where otherwise you have a huge amount of anxiety when you get a request that comes down the pipe. So yes, you think that you have that system that is well maintained, but as soon as you throw a wrench in there, which is very realistic, things can get very difficult very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? All right, cool. Thank you so much, Donnie.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the networking and the dinner and all that.
Yep, cool. I think all we need to do is just hit end, so just gonna do that now. And